What's the funniest way someone got outed for cheating? I was frosting the birthday cake when I heard, "Get out of my house. Both of you." My sister Irene's 30th birthday party had been going perfectly. 40 guests, catered food, a DJ. Her husband Brett had spent weeks planning every detail. Now his voice carried over the music, raw with anger. I rushed outside to find chaos. Irene stood by the pool in her party dress, mascara streaming down her face. Brett was pointing at her and someone else, our cousin Tate, who was shirtless and dripping wet. Other guests backed away from the confrontation. "Brett, let me explain," Irene pleaded. "Explain what? That I just caught you in the pool house with him?" The music cut off. Everyone stared. Tate grabbed his shirt from a chair, trying to cover himself. He was Irene's first boyfriend from high school, recently divorced. Brett had specifically not wanted to invite him, but Irene insisted family should be there. "It's not what it looked like," Tate said. Brett laughed bitterly. "Really? Because it looked like you two were half naked in there while I was inside greeting your mom, Irene. At your own birthday party." Irene's best friend Maria tried to intervene. "Maybe we should all calm down and..." "Did you know about this?" Brett turned on her. "How long has this been going on?" Maria's silence was answer enough. Other guests started murmuring. Irene's mom appeared from inside, took one look at the scene, and covered her mouth in shock. The catering staff stood frozen, unsure whether to keep serving appetizers. 3 months, Irene finally said. "It's been 3 months." The confession hit Brett like a physical blow. He staggered back, looking around at the party he'd spent so much effort planning. The custom decorations with their wedding photos, the surprise video messages from friends who couldn't attend, the 3-tier cake I'd spent hours decorating. "I need everyone to leave. Now." Guests scrambled to gather their things. I heard someone whisper that they'd seen Irene and Tate disappearing together at other family events. Another mentioned suspicious text messages. The gossip spread through the crowd as people filed out. Irene tried to approach Brett, but he backed away. "I want you out too. Go stay with him since that's clearly what you want." "This is my house too." "Not anymore." Tate had the decency to look ashamed as he slunk toward the gate. Irene's mom was crying, begging them both to work it out. But Brett walked inside and locked the sliding glass door behind him, leaving Irene outside her own party. I started cleaning up, not knowing what else to do. Paper plates and streamers seemed absurd now. Irene sat on a pool chair, still in her birthday dress, calling friend after friend for a place to stay. Most had seen what happened and made excuses. My phone buzzed with texts from guests who'd left. Photos and videos were already circulating. Someone had filmed the confrontation. Within an hour, everyone in our extended social circle knew about Irene's affair. Brett reappeared with a suitcase, which he threw on the lawn. "Your stuff. Don't come back without calling first." "Where am I supposed to go?" "Ask Tate." "Oh wait, he's married too, isn't he?" That's when the real bomb dropped. Tate's ex-wife hadn't divorced him. They were separated but trying to work things out. She thought he was at his brother's house tonight. Irene's face crumbled as she realized she'd destroyed her marriage for someone who wasn't even available. I drove Irene to a hotel, the car silent except for her sobbing. The birthday cake sat in my back seat. "Happy 30th, Irene," mocking us in pink frosting. At the hotel, she finally spoke. I knew Brett was planning something big. He'd been acting secretive for weeks. I thought maybe jewelry or a trip. She pulled out her phone and showed me a text from Brett sent that morning. "Can't wait for tonight. Your surprise is going to change everything." I felt sick. "Irene, what surprise?" She shrugged, defeated. "I guess we'll never know now, but I knew. I'd helped Brett coordinate it." He'd invited Irene's college roommates from Australia to fly in. They were supposed to arrive during the party. He'd also been working with her boss to arrange a promotion announcement. The whole party was meant to celebrate not just her birthday, but her achievements. "Check your email," I said quietly. She opened it and found a message from her boss, sent an hour ago. "Heard there was an issue with the party. We'll discuss the senior director position Monday." Irene stared at the screen. "Senior director? But that position wasn't even open. Brett convinced them to create it for you. He's been negotiating for months." The reality of what she'd thrown away hit her fully then. Not just a marriage, but a carefully orchestrated future. Brett had been distant lately because he was planning her dreams coming true, not because he didn't care. Her phone rang. "Tate's wife. I know about you and my husband. His brother just told me everything. You destroyed 2 marriages tonight. I hope it was worth it." Irene didn't answer. She couldn't. As I left her at the hotel, she was staring at the birthday cake I'd brought up, picking at the frosting. 30 candles waiting to be lit for wishes that would never come true. The next morning, our family group chat exploded. Brett had posted a single message. The surprise was adoption papers. We were finally approved. I guess I'll be calling the agency alone on Monday. That was when Irene fully snapped. She grabbed her phone and hurled it at the hotel wall with a scream that made my ears ring. The screen exploded into pieces and scattered across the carpet. Before I could react, she was hitting herself in the face, hard slaps that left red marks on her cheeks. I lunged forward and grabbed her wrists, but she kept screaming about destroying everything for nothing, for a man who wasn't even free. The phone at the front desk must have been ringing off the hook, because within minutes someone was pounding on our door. 2 security guards stood there looking concerned and ready to call the cops. I explained it was a family crisis while holding Irene's arms behind her back as she tried to lunge past me. They watched her collapse onto the bed, sobbing about the baby she'd never get to adopt now, the one they were going to name after Brett's dead mother. One guard asked if we needed medical help, but I promised I'd stay with her all night to make sure she didn't hurt herself. They left reluctantly after making us promise to keep the noise down. I sat on the floor next to the bed while Irene cried herself to sleep, waking up every hour gasping about what she'd lost. The next morning, she was up at 6, insisting we drive to Brett's house immediately. She needed to explain everything, to make him understand it was just fear about becoming a mother. I tried to talk her out of it, but she was already pulling on yesterday's party dress that still smelled like chlorine from the pool. I followed in my car, watching her weave through traffic like she might crash on purpose. At Brett's house, she jumped out before even putting the car in the park and ran to the front door. She pounded with both fists while Brett stood at the living room window watching her without moving. She kept hitting the door until her hands were red and swollen. Brett finally cracked the door open just wide enough to speak through the gap. He told her if she didn't leave immediately, he was calling the police and filing a restraining order. Irene dropped to her knees right there on the front lawn, begging for just 5 minutes to explain. The neighbors started coming out of their houses, some with coffee cups, watching the show like it was morning entertainment. Mrs. Henderson from next door was already filming with her phone. I grabbed Irene under her arms and dragged her back toward the car, while Brett actually pulled out his phone and started dialing. She was gasping about the adoption, the promotion, everything she'd wanted her whole life just gone. In the car, she finally admitted the truth between sobs. She'd been terrified about becoming a mom, about not being good enough, about losing herself completely, so she destroyed it all before it could disappoint her. Back at the hotel, I helped her set up a new phone while she kept refreshing our family group chat on mine. Our aunts were choosing sides, with Aunt Carol saying Brett deserved better, and Aunt Linda defending Irene as going through a crisis. Cousins were posting their opinions and theories about when it really started. Mom kept typing long messages begging everyone to stop fighting and think about the family. The chat had over 300 messages since Brett's adoption announcement. Then someone posted a longer video from the party that nobody had seen yet. It showed Irene and Tate sneaking into the pool house 20 minutes before Brett found them, her looking around to make sure nobody was watching. The comments started immediately and someone had made it public, so strangers were calling Irene horrible names. Her work friends were seeing it, her college friends, everyone she'd ever known was watching her reputation get destroyed in real time. Maria texted me asking to meet alone at the coffee shop near my apartment. When I got there, she looked like she hadn't slept either. She admitted she'd helped cover for Irene 3 times when she met up with Tate, told Brett that Irene was with her when really she was at some motel. She swore she'd told Irene to end it before someone got hurt, but felt sick about not warning Brett. She kept picking at her napkin until it was shredded all over the table. That afternoon, Brett texted me a 2-hour window on Thursday when Irene could get her essential stuff from the house. He wouldn't be there, and she could only take clothes and basic toiletries, nothing that belonged to both of them. Irene begged me to go with her because she couldn't face that house alone. Thursday came and we pulled into the driveway of the house she'd lived in for 8 years. Brett had left the garage door open and boxes stacked inside labeled clothes only and bathroom items only in his neat handwriting. We started packing her things into garbage bags because we hadn't brought boxes. Every room had their wedding photos still up, their faces smiling at us from every wall. In the bedroom, her side of the closet looked violated with hangers pushed aside and drawers left open from Brett checking what she took. We worked in silence until we reached the room at the end of the hall. The door was painted with jungle animals, and inside was a white crib already assembled with a mobile hanging above it. The walls were soft yellow with hand-painted elephants and giraffes marching around the borders. A rocking chair sat in the corner with a stuffed lamb on the seat. Irene took one look and ran out, gasping like she couldn't breathe. She made it to the bathroom before throwing up, her whole body shaking. I finished packing while she sat in the car with her head between her knees, trying not to pass out. Back at Brett's house, I went inside to grab the last bag while Irene stayed in the car. Brett's home office door was open, and I saw papers spread across his desk. An adoption folder sat there with yellow sticky notes all over it, timelines marked in Brett's neat writing. The caseworker's business card was clipped to the front with Mila Zhao printed on it. I didn't touch anything, but that name stuck in my head as I carried the bag out. In the car, Irene kept calling Tate over and over while I drove back to the hotel. 5 calls went straight to voicemail. She was leaving desperate messages when her phone finally buzzed with a text. She read it out loud in a flat voice. "Can't talk. Wife knows everything. Please stop contacting me." The phone slipped from her hand onto the floor. She stared at nothing while I parked at the hotel. Inside her room, she sat on the bed refreshing her work email every few seconds. An email popped up from Ricardo Howell, her boss. The subject line said, "Urgent. Need to discuss recent events." She opened it with shaking hands. It asked her to call him Monday morning about her position. She hadn't even thought about work seeing the party video. The reality hit her that everyone at her company probably knew by now. Her phone started buzzing with notifications from the family group chat. Layla Flores had sent a long message to everyone demanding to know who knew about the affair. She wrote that multiple people must have seen signs at family events, and she wanted accountability for who enabled this betrayal. More messages flooded in as family members started responding. Mom tried calling Layla while I watched Irene read the messages. I could hear Mom getting screamed at through the phone from across the room. That evening, Mom showed up at the hotel room with red eyes and tissues stuffed in her purse. She sat on the chair by the window and started crying about how our family was destroying itself. She admitted she thought something was weird at the last family barbecue when she saw Irene and Tate talking by the garage for too long. She didn't want to believe anything bad was happening. I told her I was keeping Irene safe, but I wasn't going to lie to anyone about what happened. Mom nodded and wiped her eyes. Then she said something that made me freeze. She told us Dad had an affair years ago that almost ended their marriage. They separated for 3 months when we were in middle school. I remembered them telling us Dad was traveling for work. Mom said she told Irene back then to always have options and never depend completely on one person. She thought she was giving good advice, but now she wondered if she planted terrible seeds. Irene just stared at her like she was seeing Mom for the first time. My phone rang while Mom was still talking. Brett's name showed on the screen. I stepped into the bathroom to answer. He said the adoption agency needed an update about the family situation. He was supposed to provide references about the home environment. His voice cracked when he asked if I'd still be honest with them. He mentioned they were going to name the baby after his late mother, Margaret. I could hear him trying not to cry. I said yes. I'd talk to them if they called. The next day, Mila Zhao called me. She was professional, but I could tell she already knew something was wrong. I stuck to basic facts about what happened at the party. She explained that major disruptions like this could pause or cancel adoption approvals, especially with legal separation starting. She said they'd need to reassess the home stability. The consequences kept expanding beyond what anyone imagined that night. Monday morning came, and Irene put on her most professional outfit to meet with Ricardo at his office. I drove her there and waited in the parking lot. She came out 40 minutes later looking pale. Ricardo had explained the senior director position was now deferred indefinitely. The board members had seen the party videos circulating online and had concerns about her judgment and stability. She still had her current job, but any advancement was off the table. That afternoon, while Irene lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Maria texted me. She'd heard from someone at her gym that a person from Brett's company had deliberately shared the party video with Irene's workplace. Someone wanted to destroy not just her marriage, but her career too. When I told Irene, she started listing every person she knew at Brett's company, trying to figure out who hated her that much. She became paranoid about everyone, wondering who else was working against her. The hotel room felt smaller every day, as the consequences of that party kept spreading like spilled wine on white carpet. 2 days later, I decided to track down Tate since nobody could reach him on the phone. I found him at his usual gym downtown, running on a treadmill like he was trying to escape his own skin. His face looked hollow and he'd lost weight in just those few days since the party. I stood right in front of his machine until he had to stop and acknowledge me. He pulled out his earbuds and stepped off, grabbing a towel to wipe the sweat that was pouring down his face. We walked to the empty juice bar area where he bought 2 waters and sat down heavily on a stool. He told me he and Irene never really stopped talking after high school. They'd just go months without contact, then start texting again. The pattern went on for years, even after they both got married to other people. He looked completely broken sitting there, but I felt nothing for him at all. That same afternoon, my phone buzzed with an email from Brett that had a legal document attached. The separation agreement from his lawyer, Corey Butler, was already drawn up, just 2 days after the party disaster. Brett wanted to keep the house and would buy out Irene's half for market value, splitting their savings down the middle. The speed of getting lawyers involved showed he was completely done with the marriage. I forwarded it to Irene, who read it on her phone and started shaking. She kept saying it was happening too fast, but I reminded her that she'd been having an affair for 3 months. The next morning, Mila Zhao called Brett about updating paperwork for the adoption file. She needed new information about the household situation and living arrangements for their records. Brett called me right after, his voice cracking when he asked if I could come to the meeting with him. He wasn't sure he could talk about the nursery they'd set up without completely falling apart. I agreed to meet them at his house the following day. That evening, Mom came over to my apartment with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine. After her second glass, she started talking about things I'd never heard before. She admitted that she and Dad had separated for 2 months when I was in middle school. They'd told us kids he was traveling for work, but really he was staying at a motel after Mom found out about his affair. She'd told Irene back then to never be totally dependent on one person, to always have her own money and options. Mom thought she was giving good advice, but now she wondered if she'd planted bad seeds in Irene's head. The next morning, I went to see Irene at the hotel to tell her about the adoption meeting. When I explained that the adoption might get canceled, she completely lost it. She started sobbing and admitted she'd been scared about becoming a mom through adoption for months. She kept wondering if she could really love a kid that wasn't biologically hers. The fear had been eating at her, and she thinks that's why she destroyed everything good in her life. She grabbed my hands and begged me not to tell Brett about her fears, because it would hurt him even more. Later that day, Ricardo called Irene while I was still there. He put it on speaker and warned her that HR had gotten multiple complaints about the party video going around. He told her to stay completely off social media and keep a low profile at work. Her 20-year career at the company was hanging by a thread, and any more drama could end it. That night, Layla texted me demanding that I give her dates and details for her divorce lawyer. She wanted me to confirm when I'd seen Tate and Irene together at family events. I told her I wasn't going to be her evidence collector and to leave me out of their mess. She got nasty and said she'd tell everyone I was protecting Tate, but I didn't care about her threats. The next morning was the home study meeting at Brett's house with Mila. Brett could barely get words out when we walked through the nursery he'd painted yellow with little elephants on the walls. I answered most of Mila's questions about the household changes, while Brett stood there looking at the empty crib. Mila stayed professional, but I could see she felt bad for him as she wrote notes about the marriage ending. After she left, Brett sat in the nursery for an hour just staring at nothing. That night, Irene spent 2 hours writing a long apology text to Brett. She sent screenshots to me first, asking if it would help. The message said she knew she'd destroyed everything and begged for just one more chance to explain. Brett's response came back within minutes with just one sentence telling her apologies couldn't rebuild trust and to only communicate through lawyers. Irene stared at her phone screen for over an hour, reading that one line over and over. The next day, Maria asked to meet me at a coffee shop near her office. She looked terrible, like she hadn't slept in days. She admitted she'd deleted Instagram messages where Irene had talked about being scared of the adoption. Maria thought she was protecting her friend by hiding the evidence, but now she realized she'd just enabled the affair. She showed me her phone where she still had screenshots of some messages before she deleted them. Irene had written things like feeling trapped by the adoption timeline and wondering if having an affair would give her an excuse to delay. Maria had told her those were just cold feet and to focus on her marriage. The cover-up went way deeper than anyone knew, and Maria had been helping hide it for months. I left the coffee shop feeling sick about how many people had known and said nothing. 3 days later, Brett's lawyer, Corey Butler, emailed me a copy of the separation agreement along with the one he sent Irene. The document was 20 pages of legal terms about dividing their assets and debts. Irene called me crying because she couldn't understand half the words. I drove to her hotel room and we sat on the bed going through each page. The house was worth $300,000 and Irene owned half, so Brett would pay her $50,000 to buy her out. She had to sign away any claims to his retirement accounts, which had another $80,000. His family inheritance from his grandmother wasn't considered joint property. The car loans would be split based on whose name was on which loan. Credit card debt from their joint cards would be divided equally. Irene kept reading the same line over and over about having no claim to future earnings or bonuses. Brett had already changed the beneficiary on his life insurance from her to his brother. Every page made the end of their marriage more real and cold. While we were still reading, my phone rang with Brett calling. He asked if I could meet him and Mila at his house tomorrow because the adoption agency needed to make a decision. I agreed, even though I knew Irene would be mad. The next morning, I met them in what would have been the nursery. Mila sat in the rocking chair Brett had assembled while he stood by the window. She explained that the agency board had reviewed their file and voted to put it on hold for 6 months minimum. After that, Brett could reapply as a single parent if he wanted. She said the name they'd chosen for the baby, Arnie after Brett's mom, would stay in the file in case he moved forward alone. Brett just nodded and signed the papers she brought. After Mila left, Brett sat on the floor of the nursery for 20 minutes without saying anything. I wanted to comfort him but didn't know how. When I got back to Irene's hotel, she was waiting in the lobby looking furious. She'd seen my car at Brett's house when she drove by hoping to talk to him. She started yelling that I was betraying her by helping him with the adoption stuff. She said I was taking his side and abandoning my own sister. People in the lobby were staring as she accused me of wanting her marriage to fail. I told her to calm down, but that made her angrier. She said I should be lying to Mila about Brett being a bad person so he couldn't adopt alone. I reminded her that lies were exactly what destroyed her life in the first place. She slapped me across the face. The hotel manager came over and said he'd call security if we didn't leave. In the parking lot, I told Irene I needed to set clear boundaries. I would help her with practical stuff like understanding legal documents or finding an apartment. But I wouldn't lie to anyone or make up stories to help her case. I wouldn't spy on Brett or pass messages between them. If she wanted my support, she had to start being honest with herself and everyone else. She stood there with tears running down her face, but finally nodded. She said she understood even though I could tell she thought I was being cruel. The next week, Ricardo called Irene with a job update. The senior director position was gone forever, but he could offer her something else. There was an opening in a different department for a regular manager role. It meant a 20% pay cut, and she'd report to someone who used to be her peer. She'd have to prove herself stable for 6 months before any promotion talks. It was humiliating, but she needed the income. She accepted immediately and thanked him for not firing her completely. That same afternoon, Corey Butler filed the official separation papers with the courthouse. I got copied on the email confirmation since I was listed as a contact. The subject line said, Perkins versus Perkins, initial filing, which made everything feel final. There was no mention of counseling or reconciliation attempts, just forms about dividing property and establishing separate households. The divorce would be final in 6 months if neither party contested anything. Mom came over that night and we talked about the family falling apart. She started crying and admitted she'd taught Irene terrible lessons about relationships. She said she always told us girls to keep secrets to avoid conflict. She thought she was keeping peace, but really she was teaching us to hide problems instead of solving them. She realized now that Irene learned to hide her affair fears instead of talking to Brett about them. Mom said our grandmother did the same thing, keeping quiet about problems until they exploded. 3 generations of women who thought secrets were safer than honesty. We both cried, realizing how these patterns had damaged our whole family. The next day, I went to get groceries and remembered the birthday cake was still in my trunk. I'd completely forgotten about it in all the chaos. The frosting had melted and run down the sides. The pink roses I'd carefully piped were just colored puddles. The Happy 30th Irene was barely readable. It smelled sour and had probably been attracting bugs. I took a photo and texted it to Irene asking if she wanted to see it before I threw it away. She drove over immediately and stared at the ruined cake for 5 minutes. She asked me to help her carry it to the dumpster. As we threw it away, she said it was perfect symbol for everything she'd destroyed with her choices. We stood by the dumpster in silence for a moment before she drove away. 2 days later, Tate texted me begging to meet him at a park. I almost ignored it, but decided to hear what he wanted. He looked terrible with bags under his eyes and clothes that didn't match. He said Layla had agreed to let him move back temporarily to try saving their marriage, but she wanted documentation about when the affair started and ended. He asked me to lie and say it only lasted a few weeks instead of 3 months. He said it would help him save his family. I told him he disgusted me. He'd destroyed 2 marriages and now wanted me to lie for him. I said he needed to face the consequences of his choices like everyone else. I told him to never contact me again and walked away while he called after me. That night, Mila called Irene directly, which surprised everyone. She said the agency wanted to offer resources even though the adoption was on hold. She emailed links to grief counselors who specialized in adoption disruption and loss of potential parenthood. She said the agency understood that Irene had lost something real, even though the baby was never placed with them. It was unexpected kindness from someone who had every reason to judge Irene harshly. Irene called me sobbing after the conversation. She kept saying, "I could have been a good mom," over and over. The reality of what she'd given up for an affair with someone who didn't even want her was finally sinking in completely. The next morning, Irene actually did something I didn't expect and called around to find a therapist who specialized in self-sabotage and relationship destruction. She made an appointment for that same week and went alone without telling anyone else, which made me think maybe she was serious about changing for once. Ricardo called her that afternoon while I was helping her unpack some boxes at the hotel and warned her about posting anything on social media that could hurt the company's reputation since people were still sharing videos from the party. She showed me her phone where she'd typed out some vague inspirational quote about rising from ashes, but then deleted it without posting, finally getting that she needed to disappear from public view completely. 2 days later, Brett texted me asking if I could come collect the rest of Irene's stuff from the garage and attic, since he didn't want to deal with it himself. I agreed, but kept our conversation strictly business, no personal talk about feelings or what happened. The garage smelled like their life together with old camping gear and Christmas decorations mixed in with her college boxes, and I had to stop myself from crying while loading everything into my car. Up in the attic, I found more boxes labeled with their wedding date and vacation memories, but what really got me was seeing the adoption folder sitting on his desk with new sticky notes he'd added that said, "On hold 6 months," and underneath, "Reapply as single parent," with that question mark that just broke my heart because he was grieving 2 losses at once. Mom came over that night while I was sorting through the boxes and started crying about her own guilt in all this mess. She admitted she'd been pushing Irene for months to ask Brett about getting promoted at work, not knowing he was already secretly arranging it as her birthday surprise. She kept saying maybe if she hadn't added that pressure, Irene wouldn't have panicked about all the life changes happening at once and ruined everything with Tate. Everyone was looking back trying to figure out their role in this disaster. 3 days later, Irene came out of her first real therapy session, looking exhausted, but somehow calmer than I'd seen her in weeks. She didn't overshare all the details, which was unusual for her, just said she had a lot of work to do on herself, and the therapist had given her homework about identifying her fear patterns that led to the affair. That same afternoon, Layla texted me again saying she'd filed divorce papers against Tate and needed Irene to sign an affidavit about when the affair started and ended for her lawyer. I texted back that I was done being everyone's messenger and blocked her number because I couldn't handle being pulled into their divorce drama too. She'd have to get her evidence somewhere else. The next morning, I met Brett at a coffee shop to hand over some mail that came to the house for Irene, and he mentioned something that made my stomach drop. Mila from the adoption agency had told him they'd received anonymous calls weeks before the party, warning about problems in their marriage and suggesting they weren't stable enough for a baby. Someone had been trying to sabotage the adoption before everything even exploded at the party, and Brett suspected it was someone in our family who knew about the affair. When I saw Irene later, I carefully asked if she'd ever contacted the adoption agency herself and watched her face crumble as she admitted the truth. She'd called them once after a fight with Brett months ago, asking about delays in the process. Not exactly trying to sabotage things, but definitely wanting to slow everything down because she was terrified. Her fear had been controlling her decisions for months before the party disaster. Brett texted me the next day saying he'd confirmed there was actually a second anonymous call from a different number warning the agency about family secrets that could affect the adoption. He was starting to realize multiple people knew about the problems and tried to interfere behind the scenes instead of just being direct and honest. Trust wasn't just broken between him and Irene, but throughout our whole family and friend group. Maria called me the next afternoon, asking to meet at the same coffee shop where we'd talked before. She looked awful when she walked in, eyes red and puffy from crying. She sat down across from me and started picking at a napkin while I waited for her to talk. After a few minutes, she finally looked up and told me she needed to confess something. She'd been one of the people who called the adoption agency about Brett and Irene's marriage problems. She thought she was protecting a future baby from being brought into an unstable home. She realized now she'd violated everyone's privacy and made everything worse by interfering. I sat there stunned while she explained how guilty she felt for enabling Irene's affair and then trying to fix things behind everyone's backs. 2 days later, I drove Irene to her lawyer's office to sign the separation papers. Brett was already there with Corey when we arrived, sitting at the opposite end of the conference table. Irene's hands shook as she signed each page while the lawyers explained the terms. She'd get $50,000 for her share of the house and nothing else. When she signed her name, she wrote it as Irene Johnson, already going back to her maiden name. Brett didn't look at her once during the whole meeting. The lawyers collected the papers, and Brett left without saying a word to either of us. Irene sat in the parking lot afterwards, staring at her copy of the agreement. That same week, Ricardo called Irene into his office to discuss her new work arrangement. He'd prepared a performance improvement plan that laid out specific requirements for the next 6 months. She had to meet monthly with him to review her progress and show she could handle her responsibilities. Any missed deadlines or unprofessional behavior would result in termination. She signed the document gratefully since she needed the income, even with the 20% pay cut. Meanwhile, Brett met with Mila about the adoption file status. She explained he could either pause the application indefinitely or convert to foster care eligibility as a single parent. Brett chose to pause everything for 6 months to figure out what he wanted. Mila said she understood and would check back in 3 months to see if anything had changed. He told me later he couldn't imagine raising a child alone right now, but didn't want to close that door forever. A week later, I spent my Saturday helping Irene look at apartments she could afford on her reduced salary. We toured 5 different places, each one smaller and more depressing than the last. She finally picked a 1-bedroom place 3 blocks from Mom's house. The building was old and the apartment needed paint, but it was clean and cheap. She joked darkly that at least she wouldn't need a second bedroom for a nursery now. I helped her fill out the rental application while she tried not to cry. Moving day came 2 weeks later, and I borrowed Dad's truck to help transport her stuff from the hotel. She didn't have much since Brett kept most of the furniture in the separation agreement. We packed her clothes, some kitchen items, and a few personal things into boxes. When we got to the bottom of one box, she found their wedding cake topper wrapped in tissue paper. She held it for a long moment before putting it in a memory box instead of the trash. She wasn't ready to throw away everything from her old life yet. That evening, Brett sent an email to everyone who'd contributed money for the party expenses. He wanted to return everyone's contributions, including the $300 I'd spent on cake supplies. I replied that I didn't want the money back and preferred not to have any reminders of that night. He wrote back with just 2 words in his response. A few days later, Maria texted me that she and Irene had met to talk about their friendship. She didn't give me details, but said they'd decided to take a long break from each other to heal. 20 years of friendship was basically over because neither of them could trust the other anymore. Maria felt guilty for covering up the affair, and Irene felt betrayed by the adoption agency call. They needed space from each other indefinitely. The following week, Mom showed up at Irene's apartment with bags of groceries. I was there helping Irene unpack the last boxes when Mom arrived with enough food for 2 weeks. She started putting things away in the kitchen while Irene and I watched. Then Mom started making dinner, chopping vegetables and cooking pasta without saying much. Irene joined her and they worked side by side in silence. Nobody talked about the divorce or the affair or any of the drama. They just cooked together like nothing had happened. Sometimes the best healing happens in quiet, normal moments when life keeps going. After dinner, Mom hugged Irene and left without any big speeches or advice. 3 days later, Mila sent official confirmation that the adoption file was on hold for 6 months. She included paperwork showing Brett could reactivate the process after that time if he wanted. She'd check in at the 3-month mark to see if circumstances had changed for either of them. The chance for adoption wasn't completely dead, but it was barely alive either. Irene got the news through her lawyer and spent the rest of that day in bed. The next few weeks, Irene built herself a strict routine that kept her busy from morning to night. She woke up at 6 for the gym, worked her reduced hours at the office, went straight to therapy twice a week, then came home and went to bed early. She deleted all her social media apps and stopped going to any family events where she might run into people from the party. When she asked me not to tell her anything about Brett or share her progress with him, I agreed, even though it felt weird keeping secrets between them after they'd shared everything for 8 years. They were turning into strangers who happened to know each other's deepest secrets. Brett texted me about some mail that kept coming to the house for Irene, so we met at a coffee shop downtown to exchange it. He looked better than the last time I'd seen him, like he'd been working out and eating right, but his eyes had that tired look people get after major surgery, or losing someone close. We kept the conversation short and practical, just talking about which bills needed forwarding and whether Irene had updated her address with the post office yet. We both knew the other person was hurting, but there was nothing we could say that would help. The whole meeting took 10 minutes and we went our separate ways without mentioning the adoption or the party or anything that mattered. Around the same time, Tate completely vanished from all family events and deleted his social media accounts. Mom heard from his brother that he was trying to save his marriage with Layla, but she filed divorce papers anyway and kicked him out. He ended up in a tiny studio apartment on the other side of town, working double shifts to pay for 2 places since Layla kept their house. Nobody in the family felt bad for him, since he'd lied about being divorced and destroyed 2 marriages in one night. His consequences were just as bad as Irene's, but at least she hadn't lied about being single when she started the affair. After 6 weeks at her new position, Ricardo called Irene into his office for her first performance review. She told me later that she'd been sure she was getting fired, but he just noted that her work had stabilized and she was meeting all the basic requirements. There was no mention of the senior director position or any future advancement, just acknowledgement that she was doing okay at her current level. She came home and cried because doing okay felt like such a small victory, but it was better than losing everything. The same week, Mila sent Irene a package with books and pamphlets about processing grief when adoption plans fall through. The materials talked about mourning the loss of children who were never born and dreams of motherhood that wouldn't happen. It was such a kind gesture from someone who didn't have to care anymore that Irene sat on her kitchen floor reading them and sobbing. She told me later it helped her realize there were still good people in the world who understood that losing the chance to adopt hurt just as much as other kinds of loss. One night, Irene and I finally talked honestly about everything that led to the affair. She brought up Dad's affair from 10 years ago and how Mom had told her to always have backup plans and never be trapped in a marriage. She could see now how that advice, meant to protect her, had made her so scared of depending on Brett that she destroyed the one person who was actually building a future with her. She understood the pattern now, how fear made her ruin good things. But understanding didn't fix anything or bring Brett back. We sat in her empty apartment surrounded by boxes she still hadn't unpacked, both knowing she'd have to live with these choices forever. That weekend, Brett posted his first social media update since the party, just a simple message saying he was focusing on work and personal healing, with no immediate plans for dating or pursuing adoption. The comments were supportive, but nobody wrote long messages or tried to set him up with anyone. Everyone understood this wasn't a story with a happy ending, just a man trying to rebuild his life after betrayal. He was choosing to handle devastation with dignity instead of anger or revenge. A few days later, I stopped by Irene's apartment to drop off a box she'd forgotten at Mom's house. She didn't invite me in, but I could see through the doorway that she had their wedding cake topper sitting on her kitchen counter right next to the printed adoption approval letter they'd gotten the week before the party. She saw me looking and quickly shut the door, both of us understanding this was where her choices had led her. There was nothing I could say to make it better, and she didn't want comfort anyway. Some mistakes are too big for apologies, and some silences hold more truth than words ever could. That's how it all played out for me. But I want to hear how you see it. Would you have done the same or gone a different route? Drop your thoughts in the comments, I'll be checking. Your takes always make these better.